In this video, you're going to start integrating Node.js and Prisma together. Remember, the big picture goal here is to allow our Node.js application to read and write from the Postgres database. Currently, the Prisma GraphQL API can indeed read and write from the Postgres database. So all we need to do is figure out how to allow Node to interact with this API. Once Node can interact with this API, Node will be able to read and write from the Postgres database. Now, to get all of this done, we are going to have to do a little bit of configuration. So that's what we're going to spend this video on. Then in the following videos, we'll actually see how we can perform all of these operations from Node.js itself. I'm excited to get to it, so let's get started configuring our app. To start with, what I'm going to do is close all of my open editors and collapse all of my uncollapsed directories. Now here we have our GraphQL basics folder and we have our GraphQL Prisma folder. What we're going to do is copy everything inside of GraphQL basics into the GraphQL Prisma folder. So I want to add these 5 things alongside of the Prisma directory itself. We're not going to be making any further changes to the GraphQL basics project because I want to leave that as a reference for us in the future. So what are we going to do? I'm going to start with package.json below. I'm then going to shift click up to node modules. I can right click and copy them. Then down below, we're going to right click the GraphQL Prisma folder itself and paste those in. Now we can close all of the open editors and collapse all of our directories once again. And inside of GraphQL Basics, we should now have the Node Modules folder, our Prisma project folder, which we had before, the source directory with all of our other files and folders, the .babelrc config file, package lock.json, and package.json itself. If you have all of these 6 showing up inside of GraphQL Prisma, then you're ready to continue on. From here, what I'd like to do is pull up the documentation for one of the 2 libraries that we're going to be setting up and configuring in this video. The first library that I want to talk about, I'm going to Google in a new tab. It is called Prisma-binding. Prisma binding gives us bindings for Node.js. So in essence, it gives us a set of Node.js methods that we can use to interact with our Prisma GraphQL API. So if we actually click on this first result, which is the repository page, we can take a look at one of the examples they have in the README file down below. If I scroll down a little bit on this page, I am looking for the slightly longer example. Here they do 2 things. First up, they configure their Node.js application to actually link to that endpoint. We'll talk about how to do that very shortly. Then what they do is they actually interact with the API. So here you can see they're using methods like prisma.query.user and prisma.mutation.createUser to interact with the Prisma GraphQL API. Every time they do this from Node, they're actually reading and writing from the database itself. This is exactly what we want to do. Now, the Prisma binding library is created by the same folks who created Prisma itself, and it is a must-have tool when working with Prisma and Node.js. So what we're going to start with is the process of actually installing and setting this up. Let's head over to Visual Studio Code and install this tool. Down below, I'm going to start by using cd to switch into the GraphQL-Prisma folder. Make sure that if you are already in the Prisma directory, use cd ... to come up a folder to this directory. And from here, we're going to use npm install to install this library. So we're going to be installing Prisma-binding at the latest version, which is indeed 2.1.1. Perfect. Now we can actually run this installation command, and once it's done, well, actually before it's even done, what we're going to do is create one new file in the source directory. We're going to call this one prisma.js, and this is where we're going to store all of the code required to actually connect our Node.js app to the Prisma GraphQL API. Now we can actually import the library we just installed and start connecting to the Prisma API. So to start, let's use an import statement. The one thing we're going to be grabbing off the Prisma binding library is a named export, and it's called uppercase P Prisma. This is a constructor function we can use to create a connection to a Prisma endpoint. Next up, we're grabbing that from the library we just installed, that is Prisma-binding. Excellent. And now down below, what we can do is actually create that connection. So what we're going to do is call this constructor function, and we want to store the return value, so I'm going to create a lowercase p Prisma constant. Right here, lowercase p Prisma as a const. And then what we do is we call that constructor function with, of course, the new operator. So that is new Prisma, this time referencing the thing we imported. And this is nothing more than a constructor function that takes a single object argument. This is our options object, and this is where we configure Node.js to connect to the correct Prisma endpoint. And there are two things that we have to provide. The first thing that we have to provide is the type defs. So we need to provide the type definitions for the endpoint that we're connecting to. This is necessary so the Prisma binding library can generate all of the various methods needed. So it doesn't always come with create user. It only has create user if you actually have a user type that Prisma is going to interact with. If we have comments, we'll also have a create comment method on Prisma.mutation. And if we add posts into the mix, we'll also have things like Prisma.mutation, .createPost, update post, and delete post. All of the same stuff we're seeing in GraphQL Playground. So we'll learn how to provide that in just a second. The other thing we have to provide is also the endpoint. Endpoint, also provided as a string, specifies the actual URL where the Prisma GraphQL API lives. Now, the endpoint is the easy one. Right here, we can just provide localhost :4466. You're going to want to use the correct endpoint for you. That is, whatever you have over here. If you have the IP address because you're on Windows, you also want to provide that over here when setting up the endpoint property. Now, the other thing we need to provide, the type defs, is a bit more complex. For this one, we actually need to introduce that second tool I mentioned we would be installing and configuring. Now, it's a common mistake to try to use the Prisma datamodel.graphql file as the value for type defs, but this is not quite correct, because think about it. We know that with our Prisma GraphQL API, we have the comments query accessible. We were able to run that and actually get our data back. Do you see the comments query listed anywhere inside of here? And the answer is no. This just represents our data model. It does not contain all of our type definitions. That is auto-generated by Prisma based off of the contents of datamodel.graphql. The only reason the comments query even exists is because we have the comment type defined inside of here. So it's actually a different file, and what we're going to do is configure a tool that's going to fetch that file. Then we can just reference that file by its path right here, and we'll be all connected to the Prisma API. Let's go ahead and pull up the repository page for this second tool as well. The second one we're going to be installing and configuring is called GraphQL-CLI. And this is just a little command line interface. It gives us about a dozen or so different commands for performing common tasks. And one of those common tasks is fetching the schema for a given API. We need to do that so we can provide it right inside of our Prisma configuration object. Now, how are we going to do that? Well, we're going to do the exact same thing that GraphQL Playground does. GraphQL Playground is clearly able to fetch the application schema since it's showing all of the queries, all of the mutations, and all of the subscriptions. We just need a way to be able to do that from our project itself, and this tool provides that in one of the commands it offers. If we scroll down just a little bit, we can see all of the commands it gives us. The only one we care about is this one right here. It is the GraphQL get schema command. This is what's going to allow us to fetch the schema and save it as a file in our project. Let's go ahead and actually install this tool from the command line. I'll start by clearing the output. Then we're going to run npm install with the library name. Once again, that's GraphQL-CLI, and we'll be grabbing the latest version at 2.16.4. Excellent. I'm going to go ahead and fire that installation command off, and once it's done, there are two things that we're going to end up doing. We're going to add a single new file into the project, and we're going to set up a single new script in package.json. The script is going to be very simple. We're just going to run that get schema command, and the file we create is going to be a little configuration file telling get schema where it can find the schema that it should be fetching and where in the project it should be saving that file. Now down below, you'll notice that in newer versions of NPM, we get all sorts of great information about the vulnerabilities of the modules we installed, And this is just an example of one. A lot of the other modules are going to have something similar. You can see we have one moderate and one critical vulnerability. Currently, there's nothing we can do about these. The GraphQL CLI is not indeed responsible for these directly. These come from subdependencies. So dependencies of our dependencies, and they'll get fixed once those subdependencies actually update. For now, there's nothing to worry about with these. What we're going to do from here is follow those 2 steps that I just outlined. We are going to create that file, and then we're going to set up that new script. Let's go ahead and start by creating that file. Now, this file needs to live in the root of our project, so in the root of the GraphQL-Prisma directory. I'm going to right-click that folder, create new file, and this one is called .graphql-config. This is going to be a JSON configuration file where we provide those 2 pieces of information. Where does the schema live, and where should it be saved? Now, before I add anything inside of this file, I do want to tell Visual Studio Code that this file should indeed be treated as JSON when it comes to syntax highlighting and formatting. You can do that via the command palette. If you forget the keyboard shortcut to bring that up, it's always right here, View Command Palette, and you should be able to find the keyboard shortcut for your operating system. Once you have the command palette open with this file indeed in focus in the background, you can search for language, and what we're looking for is this first one, change language mode. It might not be the first one for you, but that is the one we want to run. And when we click that, it's going to ask us to pick the language from a list of languages. There are all sorts of different languages that are currently supported in Visual Studio Code. We are going to pick JSON. That is the format we are currently working with. From here, we're going to create that root object, and now we can start the configuration process. So the first thing we're going to do is set up a root property called projects. We only have one project, but we're still required to set up this projects object. On here, we define the name for just that one project we have. I'm going to call this Prisma. And then we define the actual configuration for that project. So the first thing we're going to provide is the schema path property. This is going to be the path where the file should be saved. Now, in this case, we currently don't have a decent place for that. What's common, though, is to create a new folder in the source directory. This new folder ends up getting called generated. And this is where we store generated code like the file we're about to download. This is a practice you'll see amongst a wide range of different GraphQL Prisma projects. So we're going to stick with that same approach. Right here, we have to provide that path from the root of our project. So we start by going into the source folder, then /generated, then / we can pick a file name. It's common to call this one prisma.graphql. This is where we're going to have the actual type definitions saved, and this path is the same path we'll end up using over here in just a few moments. Now, that's not all we have to configure inside of here. We also have to specify the endpoint. In this case, for us, it is localhost 4466. If you're on Windows, you might have an IP address right here. We need to provide that over in our configuration as well. And to do that, we start with an extensions property. So right here, alongside of schema path extensions. Now, extensions itself allows us to define all sorts of things. We are looking to define our endpoints, so we set up an endpoints property. And then inside of endpoints, we define an endpoint for our default project. So default is the property name, and the actual URL is that URL we have over here. Now, you do have to specify the protocol. So for us, we are currently working in just HTTP, not HTTPS. // and then for me, it is localhost :4466. Perfect. And there we go. This file is now all configured. We can save that, and we're not going to be touching this one for a while, if ever. Over inside of prisma.js, we now have to link to that file that was just saved. So it's going to end up being the same exact path. We have source /generated, then /prisma.graphql. Excellent. And there we go. Everything is now configured. The last step to the process is to set up that script in package.json. So over here, we are going to create a new script. I'm going to call this script something along the lines of get schema. So get -schema. And the actual command we're going to run is a command provided by GraphQL CLI. Right here, we start with GraphQL, then a space. We are going to be using the get-schema command they provide, and we do have to provide the name of the project. Now, once again, we only have a single project, Prisma, so that is the name we're going to provide. That happens via the p argument, so right here, Prisma. Excellent. Now what we're going to do is actually run this script, and we're going to see the schema stored in the generated directory. Down below, I am going to use clear to clear the terminal output, then npm run, followed by the script name, that is get-schema, exactly as we specified right here. When I run this, it's going to connect to that endpoint, it's going to fetch the schema, and it is going to store it in our application file, and we can see that a new file was indeed generated. If I actually expand this, we can take a look, and we can see that this file is much bigger than the datamodel.graphql file we created. Everything necessary for the Prisma GraphQL API to work lives inside of here. So for example, we have a create user mutation. That's defined over here. We have the user's query. That's defined in this file as well. And if you scroll through it, you can see it's a lot of auto-generated code, and we're never going to make changes to this file. This is not a file that we ever edit. The only time this file changes is if we rerun that script and fetch the latest schema. So if I were to make a change to the Prisma API, for example, adding another type into the mix, or maybe adding a field onto one of these types, we would deploy using Prisma deploy, then we would actually fetch the updated schema running the get schema script again. And don't worry, you don't have to memorize that process. As always, we are going to move through that process in the course. For now, everything is completely set up. We have Prisma binding installed. It has everything it needs to actually connect to the API. And in the next video, we're going to go through some various examples of how we can now interact with the GraphQL API provided by Prisma right from inside of our Node.js file. That's the topic of the next video, so let's get to it. I'll see you in the next one.